Morning,
Good morning.
and welcome to Hidden Legal Figures, Spotlight on Lawyers and Judges in the Civil Rights Revolution. I'm Derek Alexander Pope, Managing Director of the Arc of Justice Institute, and we are extremely delighted to be a part of the 50th anniversary of the Southern Conference of Bar Presidents Annual Meeting. Darrell, thank you so much for extending an invitation to us to be here. It means a great deal, and I really appreciate it. His name was Harry Calvin, Jr. He was a law professor at the University of Chicago School of Law, and in the early 1960s, he was studying and writing about and lecturing on the impact that the civil rights movement had on First Amendment jurisprudence. Quite naturally, he was focused on the rights to free speech, assembly, and of course, the right to petition the government for the redress of grievances. In 1965, he wrote a book called The Negro and the First Amendment, and he made a startling revelation. In it, he wrote, "The civil rights movement was the first revolution in history conducted on advice of counsel." Now, you and I know that museums and history books and documentaries have made the generals, the lieutenants, and foot soldiers who fought that revolution household names. But the legal figures that provided the advice and counsel that shaped and sustained the success of that revolution, they've remained hidden far too long. It is the goal of the Arc of Justice Institute to bring them into plain view, and the program that you're about to experience is one of three ways that we're doing that. We've assembled this morning for you some very impressive individuals to talk about one lawyer and one judge who are emblematic of the work that lawyers and judges did during that pivotal moment in American history. We have Judge Myron H. Thompson, judge of the United States District Court for the Middle District of Alabama, who succeeded the Judge Frank Johnson, who's one of our figures we're going to spotlight. His former law clerk, Peter Canfield, a partner in the Atlanta office of Jones Day, and the chair of our State Bar of Georgia Cornerstones of Freedom program. And we also have a biographer of the lawyer we're spotlighting, Professor Maurice Daniels, to talk about Donald Lee Hollowell. Our presenters and our subjects have great star power, and it was only fitting to get our conversation started that we have someone of equal luminescence. And we are proud today to open our conversation, weekend anchor at CNN, Frederica Whitfield. So, as Darrell mentions, this is a great program. I want you to go ahead and experience knowing about these hidden legal figures. And we'll now begin our program with our moderator, Ms. Frederica Whitfield.
All right, can everybody hear me? Good morning. That's my mic check too. Can you guys hear me okay back there? All right. Well, good to see you all. This is fantastic. Today we're paying homage to, and of course, also recognizing extraordinary individuals in the judicial system. They follow their conscience, following the law, challenging law, and its interpretations and applications, all in the name of human rights and civil rights. And thanks, of course, to Derek for being the brainchild of this extraordinary venture that we're all going to be on today to further educate us about the people we know and those who we should know more about and their paths. So there are so many soldiers in this ongoing fight for civil rights. You need to know more about these individuals, which is why, despite a lot of breaking news, I don't know if you noticed, there's a lot going on out there. I am super glad and really honored to have been able to be a part of this first session that we're going to have today. And how fitting that we are going to be highlighting the breakthrough work of federal Judge Frank M. Johnson, who made tremendous marks in Alabama, while the city of Montgomery, Alabama, known for the impactful march from Montgomery to Selma more than 50 years ago, Rosa Parks' marks, John Lewis's sacrifice and leadership, that today, this week, that city would once again make history, electing its first black mayor in Stephen Reed. All of this is interconnected. It's not by mistake. So Judge Frank Johnson, known for so many moments, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. once calling him, quote, the man who gave true meaning to the word justice. Johnson's legal decisions desegregated schools in Alabama, busing in Montgomery, eliminating the state poll tax, allowed blacks to serve on juries, and authorized the 1965 Civil Rights March from Montgomery to Selma. Many other rulings also had far-reaching impact toward achieving civil rights for blacks, inmates, and the mentally ill. Peter Canfield knows him well, had the great honor of being his law clerk. And thank goodness I have him with me. You can join me right now. To help us on this journey of understanding the legacy of Judge Frank M. Johnson. Hi, Peter. How are you? Yes.
Make sure it's working. Is that, can people hear me?
Okay, everybody's good? All right, great. So let's talk about this extraordinary legacy. I mean, there really is so much to cover, but we're going to kind of truncate it, down to about 15 minutes or so. So, tell me about what you did experience was really behind the motivation of Judge Johnson's method of rule.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about his background and set the stage a little bit for sort of how he came to be in the position he was in when he was there. Judge Johnson was appointed to the bench in Montgomery in 1955 by President Eisenhower. At the time, he was 37 years old, then the youngest federal judge in the country. He was not from Montgomery. In fact, he was from northern Alabama. He was a Republican. In fact, the part of the state that he was from, the county, was sometimes referred to as the Free State of Winston, because during the Civil War, when Alabama seceded from the Union, Winston County attempted to secede from Alabama. He got his law degree from the University of Alabama, where he was a classmate and friend of George Wallace. He fought in the infantry in World War II. In fact, in the Battle of the Bulge, where he was injured, he received 2 Purple Hearts. He was actually first in the national news while he was still in the Army. He represented a number of enlisted men who were court-martialed for brutalizing prisoners at a prison camp in England. And he, as was reported in Time and Newsweek, his defense was to really aggressively push back at their commanders for being responsible. After the war, he returned to a small town in northwest Alabama, Jasper, to practice law. He was in private practice when President Eisenhower appointed him to be the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, and then eventually he became, shortly thereafter, he was appointed to the bench in Montgomery. And to set the stage, to set the scene a little bit, in 1954 was when the United States Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education, the school desegregation case. Well, it was 1 year later that Judge Johnson was put on the bench in Montgomery. 3 weeks after he assumed the bench was when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white person and was arrested and charged. That led to the Montgomery bus boycott, which catapulted into fame Dr. Martin Luther King, who was then 26 years old and had just arrived in Montgomery to be the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. It was one of Judge Johnson's his first major case was really to consider the issue of whether the law that Rosa Parks had violated that allowed segregation of buses in Montgomery, whether that was legal and constitutional. There was a challenge. There was a 3-judge court called. Judge Johnson was the junior judge on that court, and that court ruled in a divided decision that just as Brown versus Board of Education had found that segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, that principle should be extended not just to public schools, as the dissenting judge thought it should be confined, but to all public facilities. And through decision after decision following that rule, Judge Johnson applied that same principle to desegregate all the things you said.
And that underscored how he followed his conscience, yet at the same time willing to challenge the law and challenge others. And, a couple things that you mentioned, George Wallace, the relationship, he used that relationship, and also perhaps George Wallace benefited from the relationship in that they were still able to challenge one another even though they didn't see things the same way. And it would be later that Governor Wallace would acknowledge that he was wrong on the issue of school desegregation, which they sparred over, and that Judge Johnson was right. So wielding that kind of influence, did Judge Johnson, was he aware of that and the power of that position to be able to do that?
The power of, I think Judge Johnson felt very strongly, and as law clerks, he communicated that to us, that his decisions, legal opinions, they weren't for lawyers. They were for lawyers, of course, in one sense, but you had to be able to explain your decision to people in a way that they understood it. And if you could do that, then that was the only way people would obey those decisions. If they understood them, if they did understand them, they'd understand why they were fair, and that would give him the power that he did. He was very conscious that a judge's decisions are only that the worst thing a judge can do is enter a decision that he can't enforce, because if you do that, you really show that you really don't have that much power, and you make yourself subject to disobedience and all that. So he was very attuned to that. For example, when he issued his decision that allowed the Selma to Montgomery March to go forward, he didn't issue that just based on seeing what the whole nation saw in the news of people being beaten at the bridge. He held a week of hearings. He heard testimony from both the marchers and from the state. He considered details about the logistics. This was an enormous
undertaking.
It was. I mean, this is, the main artery across Alabama, and this march would essentially substantially close it for a long period of time.
What do you believe he was considering when making these decisions?
Well, I think he really did want to make sure he made the right decision, and he wanted to hear the facts. But he also wanted to make a record so that people could understand why he made the decision he did. So that.
Do you know what that compass of, putting yourself in the direction of what you believe is right? Do you know, and did you get a grasp of what his compass was?
Yeah, I think. And he was very emphatic that his compass wasn't his own morality. It was his understanding of the law and the facts. So it wasn't, he didn't sort of decide cases from his gut. He didn't feel like he was doing that. He understood that, the experience he brought to his personal experiences, that affects how you view things, but he still viewed them very much as solid legal decisions.
So the case that effectively ended the Montgomery bus boycott, one of the first big cases that you touched on, and this is Browder versus Gale, and this was an extension of the Rosa Parks, refusal to get off the seat in the bus, to give up her seat. So what do we believe the real evolution of this was for Judge Johnson?
Well, we'll show it in a second. Let me set it up a little bit. One thing that happened when I was fortunate to have happen when I was clerking was the judge had never given a televised interview before. When I clerked for him, he had just gone up on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, so I think he felt a little less pressured than he was when he was a district court judge, and a little more free to talk more freely than he had. He agreed to do an interview with Bill Moyers, who was then a PBS correspondent. Bill Moyers had been, LBJ's press secretary, longtime television correspondent. He wanted to interview the judge, and that interview took place when I was clerking. Bill Moyers was prepared to tape 4 hours to get a 2-hour show. He ended up just taping 2 hours because it just flowed from Judge Johnson. But one of the questions that Bill Moyers, one of the subjects he went into was the Rosa Parks case, and he asked him what was it like in that judge's conference room when that case came up. So we've got 2 clips talking about that.
When you were discussing that case in your private chambers after it had been argued,
the junior member of the court votes first. The senior member of the court votes last. That's followed throughout the system. That's to keep the senior member from influencing the junior member in his vote.
And you voted first?
So Judge Reeves, Frank, says, what do you think about this case? I don't think segregation in any public facilities is constitutional. Violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, Judge. That's all I had to say. It didn't take me long to express myself. The law was clear. And I might add this, Bill. The law to me was clear in practically every one of these cases that I decided were raised with the law. I had no problem with the case where we outlawed the poll tax, charging people to vote. I have no problem with the museums, the libraries, the public parks, any public facilities. The law will not tolerate discrimination on the basis of race.
And there's one additional segment.
Well, what did Judge Reeves say to you?
Well, when it came Judge Reeves' time to vote, he said, I feel the same way.
And that was it.
Sure. Well, I don't guess we deliberated over 10 minutes at the outside.
History seems to require more dramatic moments.
There were any dramatic moments in the judges' conference room.
What about
It's a cold, calculated, legal approach.
Wow. That's very revealing. So, he said the law was clear, but, we have to remind people, racism actually used law to discriminate. So he had to receive a lot of backlash from his participation, his point of view, his rulings. To what extent?
Oh, to an enormous extent. He and George Wallace had been friends in law school. They were not friends at that. George Wallace famously went around the state calling him and sounds like something you might hear today. Let me get his, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Called him an integrating, carpetbagging, scalawagging, bald-faced liar. And I mean,
But those were words,
Those were
then backlash can also, words trigger other means of backlash.
And-
Did he face that?
Yeah, I mean, crosses were burned on
Threats.
his lawn twice. His mother lived in Montgomery. His father had died at that point, but his father's name was Frank Johnson too, and his mother's home was bombed. She was not injured, but it was a blast that ripped through the entire downstairs. So there was violence. There were threats of violence. He used to keep a scrapbook of hate mail that he thought was particularly interesting that he'd received. You know, threats on the phone. There was.
He held on to it as record that it was happening, or identifying the sources of this, or was it just for his own personal history keeping?
Well, and it was probably somebody in his chambers who decided we ought to keep some of
Record.
this. But it was, he though stressed that, you know, he wasn't from Montgomery, unlike Judge Reeves, who he mentioned, who was one of the other unlikely heroes. And Judge Reeves was from Montgomery. Judge Reeves, Judge Johnson felt always took more of the brunt of some of these decisions because he was used to being in that society in Montgomery, and it totally ostracized him. The Judge Johnson used to say it's hard to ostracize somebody who likes to fish. I mean, he'd just soon be out fishing than you know, at a country club.
So Peter, in 1979, Judge Johnson gave a commencement address at Boston University School of Law. In part of the speech, he said, the law should be realistic enough to treat certain issues as special. A judiciary that cannot declare that is of little value. So he clearly made a huge lasting, you know, impact. Is it to your surprise that more people don't know about him and know about his path?
It is surprising that people, and
That
Judge,
he's more front and center.
and Judge Thompson were talking about that. We have trouble thinking of him as a hidden legal figure, but and I think there's a lot of value in making sure people remember him, and I think as a segue to Judge Thompson coming
Perfect.
up here, we're going to show
So
a
Judge Myron
video.
Thompson, yes, succeeded. Judge Frank Johnson.
And we have a video we were going to go ahead and...
Yes, I love
if
it.
that's okay.
Let's watch.
Thanks. Should I move over?
History has a way of challenging us, judging us, compelling us. In the autumn of 1955, a newly appointed Alabama federal judge encountered a hard-working seamstress and the minister of a small congregation on a path destined to change the arc of history. Judge Frank M. Johnson's historic civil rights decisions not only led to ostracism, cross burnings, and death threats, but helped to change the face of the segregationist South and steadfastly forge a new way forward. In his courtroom, he applied constitutional principles that led to equal justice, civil rights, and human decency. During this turbulent era, the bravery of Rosa Parks, the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King, and the decisions of Judge Frank M. Johnson challenged Americans to decide what kind of people they wanted to be. As we grapple with other critical issues, we learn from these lessons of history that gave true meaning to the word justice. Today, surveying the national landscape, the need for a non-political presentation of the constitutional principles that guide our nation's struggle to create a more perfect union is more necessary than ever. The Judge Frank M. Johnson Jr. Institute will stand as a beacon for equal justice under the law, mutual respect, and human dignity. designed to build bridges from the past for a more enlightened future. A place for learning and illumination, placed in the fulcrum of the original civil rights movement in Montgomery, Alabama. A place to enhance understanding of our Constitution and the rights and liberties it guarantees in our quest for liberty and justice for all. The Judge Frank M. Johnson, Jr. Institute.
Very nice. And Judge Myron Thompson succeeded Judge Frank M. Johnson. And I mean, this legacy, Judge, in what way did it either position you or set you up to craft your own legacy?
Oh my goodness. Let me put it this way. I succeeded Frank Johnson. I did not replace him. No one
Sure.
replace him.
Your
Do I
mic.
have my mic? It's not on. That shows you just how much I did not replace him.
You got it?
Let's see here.
Should turn green.
Still
There
red.
you go.
Now it's
I see a
green.
light.
Can you hear me now?
There's the
Okay.
light.
Well, I was supposed to.
Yeah, you can still.
I really wanted to cover two, well, I guess I'll just use this, two broad points. Frederica, your first question about, why do people not know about Judge Johnson? And I think you posed that question to Peter.
Yes.
And I don't know how many of you have seen a video that's showing, going around a university, I think it's the University of Texas, asking students certain civic questions, such as, what are the three branches of government? Name a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. Just these basic questions about our country. And virtually none of them can answer it. Literally none. And yet, of course, they can tell you, as far as we're talking about people in entertainment, in Hollywood, even though this is the Hollywood of Georgia, that they can tell you who's married to whom, and how long X has been living with Y, and for people in entertainment. But they can't tell you very much, if anything, about our government. This was sort of brought home to me in a case that I was trying back in the late 80s. This was before Obama was president. And it was a race discrimination case. And the question was posed by the lawyer to a witness who had been accused of discrimination. Can you name one black person who impresses you? And the witness said, Aunt Jemima. This guy was an engineer. He had gone to college. I think that he probably, if he had had time to think about it, would have said Dr. King or Rosa Parks. But I think the point is that his initial quick reaction was Aunt Jemima, who, by the way, doesn't exist, really, let alone would be someone you would be impressed with. And so you asked this question about Judge Johnson. I think it's part of the fact that that we forget our history. And I think to answer that question, you almost have to start with the question of, why do we study history? And we study history, as we've all learned when we were in elementary school or high school, not only just not to repeat it, but also to learn from it, because democracy is an incredibly fragile institution. And it depends upon firm and understanding support from the populace, and that means understanding history. And so therefore, organizations like the Frank M. Johnson Institute, the Arc of Justice, by the way, serve that purpose, and a critical purpose, in particular in today, when so many people just really don't know anything about our government. And to understand its past is to understand the government. And to understand its past is to make sure that we're faithful to the principles that underlie our current government. But I think that there's an even more direct question, is why study Frank Johnson? You've heard about this just just incredible man. You know, why him in particular? I don't know if Peter didn't mention it, but you know, Frank Johnson was on the cover of Time magazine at one point. And yet, when I was in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago, visiting with Justice Kennedy, who was then on the Supreme Court, he had not retired, he said he asked all of his law clerks, had any one of them heard of Frank Johnson? Now, these are law clerks who come, arguably, from the most prestigious schools in the country, who studied the law, you know, with some seriousness. Not one had heard of Frank Johnson. I'm willing to bet not one had heard of Elbert Tuttle. If you go to many law schools today, most students will not have heard of people like Frank Johnson and Judge Tuttle. So the question is, you know, why study about them? And to really understand why we should study about them, you have to go back a little bit. And it's, I really think it's important to remember the circumstances under which Frank Johnson existed and ruled. We're talking about the Jim Crow laws, or the Jim Crow, I would call it, society. There were, of course, the Jim Crow laws, where you were born, where you went to school, what hospital you went to, where you ate, where you went to the restroom, what water fountain you drank out of, where you died, where you were buried, were all determined by a law that said that blacks were treated separately. But that was not all that Jim Crow said. There was also the Jim Crow culture. It was unwritten, but just as important. How we address someone in public was based on who you were, what race you were. Whether you stepped aside, whether you demurred. If you were black, you did both. That culture was just as important as the law. And then there's something we really fail to forget, but fortunately in this day and time have been reminded of. Jim Crow violence and torture. What I would call our American form of terrorism. Of course, because if you were black, you were less human, you were subject to this at will. But it was also the means by which the Jim Crow laws and the Jim Crow culture were kept in place. If you even challenge these laws, if you even challenge this culture, you face the violence. In other words, the Jim Crow violence kept you from even challenging that structure. And you'll get that if you come to Montgomery and you visit the lynching memorial. That's what's so critical. It was the thing that kept it all together, this violence. And it was condoned in the South. Now, when I think about this, you know, something comes to mind every time I think about Jim Crow and the Jim Crow culture. It reminds me of a controversial statement made by Hannah Arendt in her coverage of the Eichmann trial, in her participation, or his participation in the Holocaust. And she called it the banality of evil. The statement was controversial because it had two meanings, or could have two messages. In one sense, it connotes that evil is commonplace. It is everywhere. In a more controversial sense, it connotes that evil is so commonplace that no one bears responsibility. In that case, we were talking about Eichmann. The Eichmann defense of, I was obeying orders, I was a bureaucrat, and above all, I was just a bystander. I merely lived in and grew up in this society. Eichmann was not a soldier. He was just there. But he was a part of the bureaucracy. For Frank Johnson, the concept of the bystander, the Eichmann defense, was not there. Whether it was gassing the Jews in Germany, or lynching black people in Montgomery, Alabama, or gay bashing in Laramie, Wyoming, hatred of people because of what they are, not who they are, whether it be a Jew, a black, or a homosexual, and not based on their character, was simply unacceptable to him. And this banality of evil was pervasive here in the South. From hospitals to schools, everywhere it existed. The thing about Frank Johnson, though, is you say, well, he was a federal judge. He could make these changes. But what was so remarkable is that he grew up in that very culture that he sought to change. In other words, here was not someone rendering decrees from Washington, D.C., or rendering decrees from Massachusetts. Here was someone who was existing in the very culture he sought to change. And in fact, what's so remarkable about him is that he's seeking a culture that he himself had grown up in. He stands as a symbol that Frank Johnson does to me, that in this culture of what I would call this banality of evil, and I can't characterize Jim Crowism as anything other than pure, unadulterated evil, that the goodness in the hands of one person, just one good person, despite this banality, can change things. I still raise the question of, why did he do it? What's so special about him? Some people say, well, he grew up in Winston County. Winston County was in Alabama. It was segregated. Probably a little bit more tolerant, but still segregated. Mm-hmm. So why? And I puzzle with that question. What makes some people stand up against the tide, even the tide of your own community, even when your own relatives won't stand with you? I had that happen in a case or two. I had the case involving the Ten Commandments in Alabama and the Chief Justice. And my aunt, whom I met at a party later, says, I like you, Myron, but you've gone too far. But here was Judge Johnson, who literally was standing up in many cases against his own relatives. And still the question is, why? I think one reason, and it's an easy reason, but I think it's a clear reason. And would you put up a picture of Ruth Johnson?
Yeah.
One of the reasons is right there. Ruth. I knew Ruth. And she was a real Ruth, let me assure you. She was as steely and strong as he was. I tell people today that in this day and time, she would have been a Judge Johnson too. And people often ask, why did he have a backbone? Why was he so strong in his backbone? I say, Judge Johnson did not have a backbone. He had two backbones. He had Ruth and himself. So that's one of the reasons. And to have known her, which was my true pleasure, it's just something that I treasure every day. Many courts take what they call oral histories of people who are important to the court. When I was Chief Judge of the Middle District of Alabama, I took an oral history of Ruth, his wife. I recently went to a conference about famous judges in the civil rights movement. No other judge's wife's oral history had been taken, because I don't think anyone realized just how important those women were to the judges. And to know Ruth was to know that she and Frank were one. And I really think that if you really want an explanation as to why he was so strong, I think it's because she stood there with him shoulder to shoulder. And if you talk to her, you would know that sometimes he may have been mouthing her. That's what kind of woman Ruth was. And so that's why I took a long oral history, which we have preserved. The other person I think who was important in Frank Johnson's history, I hope I'm not going too long, is Judge Richard T. Reeves. Peter mentioned Judge Reeves. Judge Reeves was born in Alabama, right? Unlike Frank Johnson. Judge Reeves was born in Montgomery, unlike Frank Johnson. And so he lived in that community. He had grown up in that community. But he cast the second vote in many, and most importantly in the case involving transportation. And Judge Johnson is right. He got the brunt. People would not sit next to him in churches. His own family was ostracized. He was ostracized. Judge Reeves lost his son in an accident, a very young son, and people threw trash on his son's grave. I want to tell you a story about Judge Reeves, and this is a personal story about me as well. When I was appointed in 1980, I knew about Judge Reeves. And I knew about him, and I knew that he had not received the respect that I thought that he deserved in this history about what I consider unsung heroes, which you've talked about, Derek. Judge Reeves, when I started serving, had become senile. And he used to come to the courthouse every Thursday, and he would have lunch with the chief judge of the circuit, who was in Montgomery, called John Godbold. John Godbold would be out of town often, so he called me up. I, being a young judge, would never say no to the chief judge of our circuit, said, yes, I will join the two of you for lunch, and the three of us would go out to lunch. They eventually reached a point where Judge Godbold had to leave town, and Judge Reeves and I went to lunch alone. I took Judge Reeves to lunch for 2 years. He never said one word to me. He was senile. He would come to the office. I would go up to his chambers. We would walk to a little cafe called the Francis Cafeteria. He would order the same thing. I was so afraid he was going to fall because he was so unsteady. We would sit down, say nothing. I'd carry him back, and then I'd leave him. And then his wife would come pick him up. But that man was so important in my life that I thought that of all my duties as a judge, that is one of the most important ones that I performed. And I think that when Peter, you talked about the case where Judge Reeves and Judge Johnson decided the public transportation case. I think that that was a learning lesson for Judge Johnson. You know, I'm sort of, this is my own take on this. The third judge on that court was Judge Lynn. Judge Lynn voted against allowing the desegregation of public transportation. And I think it's important to understand why Judge Lynn voted the way he did. He thought that Brown versus Board of Education controlled public education, but Plessy versus Ferguson controlled transportation. And the Supreme Court had never overruled Plessy versus Ferguson. And therefore, he thought that until the Supreme Court overruled Plessy versus Ferguson, which covered railroads and so forth, he was bound by that. When Judge Reeves said, Frank, I agree with you, that was a dramatic turn. It was dramatic for two ends. Frank Johnson was this young man. In some ways, he was a whippersnapper. Judge Reeves was old Montgomery, a lot older, a lot more established. And yet he stuck his neck out. And Judge Johnson, you know, he says it was easy to make that decision. I'm not so sure that everyone in this room would have made that decision back then against her own culture, against her own relatives, and having Plessy versus Ferguson on point. That was a very, very brave decision by Judge Johnson. And it was an incredibly brave decision by Judge Reeves. And that's why I took him to lunch every day. I also want to talk about Frank Johnson when you ask these questions about, how did he decide cases? I sat on one case with him, a three-judge case, a voting rights case, my first case that I sat on a three-judge court. And I had written a fairly long memo. My law clerks actually had. And started to read it when we met in the back room. And Judge Johnson's right. I was a junior judge, so I got to talk first. And I started to talk about why we should rule for the plaintiffs in this voting rights case. He stopped me in the middle and he said, Myron, I like your memo. I'll read it later. But what do you think we should do? And then I said, I think we should rule for the plaintiffs because I think the evidence is obvious, blank, blank, blank. He says, I agree. Turns to the other judge. What do you think? I agree. Myron, go write something, but keep it short. Anyway, Peter, he did rule on the law, but his sense of fairness was incredible. And I think he did have a prescience about where the law was going. And those decisions were not easy decisions. You know, I also, when I think about Judge Johnson, I got 1 minute left. I think about also talking about what makes a great judge. I had a case before him as a trial lawyer, so I want to talk about even from that perspective. And this was a little case. This is not a case about public transportation. This is not a case that's going to the Supreme Court. It's probably not even going to the Court of Appeals. It's not that winnable. But what happened was Judge Johnson was in Dothan, Alabama, where I had this, my law practice. I had just set up. I'd just gotten out of law school. I wanted to be sort of like Jimmy Stewart out of Anatomy of a Murder. I had my office in the front, and I lived in the back, and because I was poor, and all I wanted to do was just open my door and tell people to come in. So Judge Johnson's secretary calls me on the phone and says, "You've been appointed to a criminal case." And I said, okay, because I knew I couldn't tell him no. And I said, when is it going to trial? And they said, tomorrow. This is before, you know, you respected those things like preparation. But still don't tell Judge Johnson no. So I go to my client, and I say to my client, I say, give me the facts. And he says, well, you know, they stopped us, and they think that I had these drugs, and I'm really not guilty, and I have a witness who can prove it, and not only can this witness prove it, this witness, and by the way, this took place on an Army installation, this witness is an Army, is a military police officer, so he's credible. He can prove that I'm innocent. And I said, what's the witness's name? He says, the witness's name is John. I said, John? You know, I'd only been practicing law maybe a year or two, but I knew that when you go to someone and they say only one person can tell you, can prove you're innocent, they only have one name, a first name, no last name, no address, you know that guy's guilty. I mean, even I had that much sense as a young lawyer. But I did something that I don't know if I'd have the courage to do today if I were a young lawyer. I filed a motion with Judge Johnson to subpoena John. And I went over there and I thought I'd be laughed out of court. This little old case. He granted it. He had the FBI look for John.
Wow.
The entire FBI. That midnight, I got a call from an FBI agent saying, we found John. They put John on the phone. He proved my client was innocent. I met him at the airport. They flew him into Dothan. They dropped the charges. There was no little case in Judge Johnson's court. No such thing as a little case.
Wow.
All cases were important. You know, I think that was really the driving force behind it when people wonder why, you know, what makes a great judge. Is I think there are no such things as little cases in his court. I think they were all based on his belief in the humanity of all people, whether you were black, whether you were a woman, whether you were gay. I just think he believed in that individual humanity. And it permeated everything he did. And in that sense, his decisions were easy. But finding out how to get to the end of that result was incredibly difficult. And as a judge who's been practicing for many, many years, I can attest to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Judge Thompson. So I know there are a lot of questions, a lot of curiosities in the room. You'll see the microphones are placed. So start thinking about your questions. I'm going to ask one question to Judge Thompson, but you can make your way up to a microphone, and we'd love to entertain your questions. So you just mentioned before, you know, your storytelling that you did not replace the judge, but as you took to the helm, as you took that seat, how much was he in your ear? How much was he in your heart?
Well, obviously, very much in my heart, and because he was on the Court of Appeals, very much in my ear.
And I was your first law
Actually,
clerk,
Peter
too,
was my
so-
first law clerk. I inherited Peter from Judge
Wonderful.
Johnson.
So,
No, I think his presence is still felt on that court. Those overarching principles that I've talked about respect for individuality, respect for human beings. I think that's, in fact, people ask me, why is it even important to know about Frank Johnson? Why is it important to know about the lawyer you're going to talk about in a few minutes? I want to tell one other little short story. I was, in the whole thing about the bystander defense, which I say is no defense at all. I was in Canada not too long ago speaking to a group of lawyers, and on my way to the speech, I took a taxi. And the taxi driver and I got into a conversation. And it ended up that the taxi driver was from Rwanda. And of course, I went, oh, you're from Rwanda? And of course, I want to ask about Rwanda. And yes, he was there during the Rwanda genocide. And then he tells this story about how when the soldiers came in and the town, you could hear them outside, and there were the rumblings and the violence getting nearer and nearer, and how he and his family went to a church, and they all would lie down on the floor in the church, and the soldiers got nearer and nearer. And finally, he says they came into the church, and then he says he passed out, but he doesn't know why he passed out. He was a teenager. He said he would have been about 15 or 16 at the time. He woke up to find out that his mother, his father had all been killed. In fact, they'd been chopped up literally around him. That was how horrendous. He made his way out of the church and he started running. And he ran to a nearby African country, and he finally got to South Africa. And the Canadian embassy there was looking for these survivors. And he signed up, and they took him in, and they brought him to Canada. And I was thinking to myself, even on the world stage, there are no bystanders. These horrific things, whether it's happening in Rwanda, or whether it's happening in the South back, or whether it's happening in any other part of this country, there are people willing to stand up and help. In this case, it was Canada. And these atrocities continue today. And I think the message of Frank Johnson and why we study him is he symbolizes that the bystander rule or the bystander defense is no defense at all. Either you participate or you are responsible for the evil.
Any questions from the audience? Okay, think about your questions. Start making your way to the microphone. This is your opportunity. So then, Peter, when we talk about this culture of hate that you underscored, at the time of Judge Johnson serving, what is it about him where he was able to separate himself from this culture of hate and be led by what he thought the right thing to do was? What was it about him that allowed him to do that?
That's a very hard question.
Because you talk about this, banality of evil, but it was a culture. When everybody else, when the majority is saying this is the way to think and feel and do, overwhelming, and he is, the salmon going upstream. He's what allows you to do that? What is it about him?
I think part of it was that he was somebody, and I don't know if it was part of his upbringing or what, but he didn't do things casually or by accident. When he said something, he wasn't flippant. He knew what he was going to say. He was very deliberate about everything he did. So I think that's just a way of saying he thought before he did things. And so he thought before he would he would go with the flow of hatred or whatever it was at the moment. He would think for himself and reach his own conclusion.
Still silence from you guys? You're kidding me. Are you really that shy? I thought this was a boisterous group. Go ahead, microphone right there.
So it seems like the political discourse on judicial selections has changed dramatically over the period of time that when Judge Johnson was appointed a Republican by a Democrat to today. And I guess it seems to me if you guys have any ideas or concepts that could help so that we have judicial appointment and the process becomes maybe back to that, what would make a good judge is a less politically sort of charged appointment in the process. So that we can get back to a Judge Johnson sort of appointment.
So is the question that will it ever be removed or?
I think in general, the process, I mean, today, I think if a Republican appointed a Democrat or a Democrat appointed a Republican, it would be much more unusual. And I don't know if there's anything or any suggestions you have, because I think what we all believe here is in the system of justice that should be, obviously colorblind and maybe, it's that third branch of government that's the check and balance of the other two. And it's important that we have the independence of the judiciary. And how do we get maybe back there?
I think the thing that's remarkable about Judge Johnson is, of course, he was appointed by Eisenhower, a Republican.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Even though
He was very.
when he was appointed to the 11th Circuit by Carter, a Democrat, which shows that when you have his character, party doesn't always or shouldn't matter. Unfortunately, I think it may matter to some people. There were some people who opposed him when he was appointed to the 11th Circuit by Carter. But I think the important thing is to start appointing judges based on merit and assume that they will follow the law. Now, what it means to follow the law can be interpreted in different ways. And perhaps because it can be interpreted in different ways, we shouldn't assume that someone should sort of betray their allegiance before they assume the office. But what you do want to feel comfortable with is that they will comply with the law. And I don't think anyone can say that Judge Johnson never followed the law. They might have disagreed with his interpretation of the law, but they couldn't say that. And I think it's a return to the notion of appointing judges who are strong, who have merit, and whether when I was first appointed to the bench, I would cringe when I was on a 3-judge court and they would say 2 whites and 1 black. Or now you hear, blank blank ruled and he was appointed by Carter, or blank blank ruled and he was appointed by Clinton, or blank blank ruled and she was appointed by Bush. Everything is political now, and there was a time when that wasn't true, and I don't have a solution to how to undo that, but I think that is a flaw in our system.
Thank you.
And I mean, one story that might relate to that, at least, is that when Judge Johnson was on the bench as a district court judge and the freedom rides were happening, and the riders were being beaten and buses set on fire. Jack Bass, in one of his books, talks about how there was a meeting at the White House with President Kennedy. So Robert, who wanted to do something about this, Robert Kennedy, who was then the Attorney General, and Burke Marshall came to the White House to talk about what we're going to do. And they wanted to go into court and get protection for the riders, and they were trying to figure out which court to go into. And I don't know if it was President Kennedy was wondering, why do we want to go before a Republican judge in Alabama? But when they made the decision as to which judge to go to, Burke Marshall said the reason we want to go to Judge Johnson is not because they thought, he was ideologically in their camp somehow. Burke Marshall said he's clear, he's concise, and he's direct, and that's what we need. We need a judge who will do those things now. So,
and also, I think it's important to remember that Judge Johnson had his own views about Dr. King. He respected Dr. King greatly, but he was not necessarily a fan of all the demonstrations. He had some problems in particular with the violence, not caused by Dr. King, but in response to what Dr. King was doing. In fact, I think in the Montgomery to Selma March, he enjoined both sides from marching initially. But the point here is that he wasn't in anyone's camp. There was no such thing as a camp. What he did was he had the hearing, he enjoined both sides, and then he decided, in I think it's one of his best opinions, he said the enormity of the wrong here is so big and the right that's being violated is so great that this march has to take place. In other words, there are exceptions to even closing a public highway. You have to allow it. It's just such a big deal. And so he wasn't in any camp, because he had enjoyed that march to begin with.
We have time for one more question. Yes? And could you go to the microphone just to make sure everybody can hear you? Oh, okay, then to your right.
Mr. Canfield, I think you said earlier that Judge Johnson was careful not to issue an opinion that he feared couldn't be enforced. I wonder if you could explain that. I was privileged one time to hear deceased Justice Powell talk about U.S. versus Nixon, and he described in that speech how much they worried whether the president would comply with the court order to enforce the subpoena. And he said, you know, what could we do? We could send up the U.S. Marshal to the White House and knock on the door and ask for the tapes. But they didn't fear issuing that opinion, although they worried about that outcome. I just wonder if you could expound on your comment.
Sure. So, for example, in the Selman and Montgomery March case, before he issued his order, he made sure that that President Johnson was prepared to nationalize the Alabama National Guard to help enforce it. He didn't just sort of hope that would happen. He got a commitment that that would happen before he did it. He had, I remember a story about that he just prepared and thought ahead about what would happen. He let the Fifth Circuit know when the order was going to come out. And so when he brought the lawyers in to tell them, I'm about to issue this order, he said, I've called the Fifth Circuit. If you file an appeal, Governor Wallace, if you're going to file an appeal, they're set to hear you at 5 p.m. this afternoon. I've checked at the airport. There's a flight that'll get you to New Orleans in time. To the point that one of the lawyers said, well, Judge, did you make reservations for us? But he just thought through all those consequences before he did something.
He didn't shoot from the hip on things like that. It was well and thoughtfully planned.
All right, thank you, Peter Canfield, Judge Myron Thompson, for helping to pay homage to an extraordinary federal judge, Frank M. Johnson, and thank you for your questions as well. Derek Alexander Pope is back. Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed that.
For his reflective insight, his thought-provoking commentary, and her brilliance. Join me again in thanking Peter Canfield, Judge Myron Thompson, and Frederica Whitfield. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
As Frederica mentioned, there are some things happening in the nation right now. She has to get back to the studios to bring us that real definition of breaking news.
Thank you very much.
And so we thank you again for being with us this morning, Frederica. We're going to take a 10-minute break because we'll come back and we'll have our second segment about Attorney Donald Lee Hollowell. 10 minutes and we'll see you right back here. Thank you.
Wonderful.